Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy, and we thank you for joining us for Where We Come From and Where We're Going with Ann Tashi Slater, class of '85, and Amanda Dennis, class of '03. My name is Nancy Lynn, class of '77, co-chair of the Asian American Alumni Association of Princeton, also called A4P. For Tigers who aren't familiar with A4P, we are the university's affiliated group for alumni of Asian origin and friends. The geographic scope covers South Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as East Asia. So Asian Americans, Asian anywhere, and friends. This event was initiated by Princeton Club of Japan, Stoughton Lewis, class of '93, and Princeton Alumni Association of France, Aimé Laossois, class of '93, and is co-sponsored with A4P, with the Princeton Association of New York, Princeton Women's Network of New York City, and Princeton Women's Network for Princeton area. We have a good turnout coming on, and I expect more will be coming, but about 125 people had registered. Alumni from class years 1967 through 2022, which is a pretty broad 55-year sweep of Tigers, so a very interesting topic and very relevant for many. So who are Ann and Amanda? Ann Tashi Slater contributes to The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The New York Times, Catapult, Tin House, AGNI, Tricycle, and others. She speaks and teaches workshops in the US, Asia, and Europe, and recently finished a memoir about reconnecting with her Tibetan roots. A longtime resident of Tokyo, she's a professor of American literature at Japan Women's University. Amanda Dennis holds a PhD from Berkeley, a master's in philosophy and European languages from Cambridge, and a master's in an MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her writing has appeared in Guernica and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and she is assistant professor of comparative literature and creative writing at the American University of Paris. Her debut novel, Her Here, will be published by Bellevue Literary Press in March 2021. The format of today's webinar will be a conversation between Ann and Amanda. Ann will read from her work and talk about her writing process, as well as discuss her Tibetan American identity, dialogue across generations and borders, and how we relate to our cultures of origin as we figure out where we come from and where we're going. So their conversation will also include mother-daughter relationships, travel and its impact on writing, and second-generation children connecting with their countries of origin, just to name a few fascinating dimensions. And we will have a Q&A session right after. With that, let's begin. Ann, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I think Amanda was going to say a few words, is that right? And then we'll...
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's interesting and wonderful to gather in this way. And Ann, I am looking forward to hearing you read from your forthcoming memoir, Paradise Lands. But I wondered if you could first tell us a little bit about the book and also maybe a little bit about its structure too.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you to Princeton Club of Japan, to Stoughton, and to MA, Princeton Club of France, and then Princeton Alumni Association of France, and then also Nancy, thank you very much, and the A4P for hosting this. So my mother is Tibetan, and she came to the United States from Darjeeling when she was 19 to study medicine. And she stayed. She didn't go back to India. She just settled in the US. And I grew up in New Jersey and California. So this book, the memoir, is about, it's got basically three narrative lines. And one is this present day trip with my mother to India. And it takes place in Delhi and Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama lives in exile, and Calcutta, and then also Darjeeling, my mother's hometown. And that part is about reconnecting with my mother and reconnecting with my Tibetan roots. And then the second one is kind of a journey into my past, growing up Tibetan American and spending time in Darjeeling after graduating from college, and then settling eventually in Japan. And I've now lived in Japan for over 30 years. So, and then the third one is about my relationship with my daughter, which is about how I have tried to raise her differently from how I was raised. So this, in the section I'm going to read, my mother and I have just arrived in Calcutta. And I'll just read a little bit. This is a place that my mother often visited when she was a girl. And I'll just read a little to give a feeling for the memoir. Blue evening in Calcutta. My mother and I will be here for a week before heading north to Darjeeling, her hometown in the Himalayas. We arrived today at my aunt and uncle's apartment, which is around the corner from the old theater road. I stand out front, waving goodbye to a friend who came for tea. Rickshaws and taxis rattle past on the one-way street. At certain times of day, the traffic changes direction. Plumeria blossoms lie scattered on the ground, fragrant iridescent stars fallen from the sky. The temperature is mild, drawing me in as another element in the landscape of rustling leaves, humid air, crows peering from the ledges of weathered buildings. The puddles left from an afternoon cloudburst mirror the trees, the cotton candy clouds bobbing in the twilight. A boy strides into view with a big black umbrella tucked under his arm. A mustached man in a faded dhoti strolls by, beating a drum and leading two monkeys on a leash. On evenings like this in the 1930s and 40s, my mother enjoyed riding horse-drawn carriages down Strand Road along the Hooghly River, past the steamers and barges plying the fast-running waters. The family went on pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya during the winter school holidays, first stop Calcutta. Traveling on the overnight train with bedding, pots, and pans, they would arrive early the next morning at Howrah Station. There was a visit to Fleury's Tea Room on fashionable Park Street, to Outram Ghat to hear the brass band play John Philip Sousa, to a bakery in Newmarket for Turkish delight and halva. As we strolled about today, the city seemed like a palimpsest, the family stories laid upon a terrain ready to be written upon now by me and my mother. Back in the apartment, my mother and I ordered tukpa noodle soup from a nearby restaurant and eat at the polished mahogany dining table. My mother is quiet, gazing downward. Her body is here, but her spirit is elsewhere. She finishes her soup and says, "I'm going to retire. It's been a long day." I watch as slowly she makes her way along the hall to the bedroom. I have felt sure that, like my grandmother, my mother will remain fully herself until her time comes, when she's 100 or even older. But now I wonder and worry. I take the dishes to the kitchen and start washing up. Outside the window, a 3/4 moon floats next to a solitary star. The sorrow of things seeps through me, the melancholy of this city that, with its dilapidated colonial buildings, its dusky tropical light and smell of the sea, is about memory and absence. Somewhere here is the hotel where, in 1980, my grandfather had a fatal heart attack. The sadness overcame him in his old age, my grandmother told me. It was his grief about the children, all 5 of them settling abroad. I see my mother walking down a Calcutta street under her red umbrella, wearing tie-dye pants and a fanny pack, looking like a stranger in her own land. I think of her in the bedroom, the ceiling fan whirring, the mosquito net swaying like a wraith in the dim light. What would she have thought if someone had told her as she set off to study in America that almost 60 years later she would be a divorced, retired doctor living in California, back here in Calcutta on this summer night with her American daughter? I wander around the apartment, the marble floor wonderfully cool under my bare feet. My aunt and uncle have exquisite taste. There are painted Chinese screens and carved cabinets, richly detailed Tibetan Tanka scroll paintings and plush rugs, framed antique maps of northern Hindustan, India, the eastern provinces, and Bengal, mouths of the Ganges. I study the maps, the rivers flowing down from the Tibetan plateau to the Indian Ocean. I see the dark, silent tides carrying my grandparents' ashes from the Teesta River near Darjeeling to the Bay of Bengal and out to sea. Why do we become fascinated with rivers and even more with their source? We feel an atavistic impulse to learn where they and we come from, to trace their trajectory. A bookcase in the living room holds volumes on Asian history, economics, and politics. I leaf through The Tiger Ladies, Sudha Kohl's account of growing up in Kashmir and emigrating to the US. She writes, We come from a place, Kashmir, where people hardly think of even their grown children as separate persons with different goals for their well-being. Here in America, every new baby is an individual, and we have to explain ourselves to our children. They think they are free and don't know that eventually they will come looking for us. I have indeed come looking for my mother and for those before her. Uninterested in my Tibetan heritage as a girl, I've ended up devoting decades of my life to a slow archaeology of researching and writing about my family history. Moving forward through the years, I've traveled back in time and memory, my mother's, my grandparents', my own. In America, land of invention and reinvention of self, we're taught we are tabula rasa. We learn to go outward, not inward. This makes it easy to forget we are already shaped and being shaped by our parents and grandparents, by all our ancestors. As I prepared to leave for college, my mother presented me with a tear-shaped turquoise pendant her father gave her when she left for America. I imagine my grandfather picking it out in an old shop in the Darjeeling Bazaar, suit jacket draped over his arm and a look of concentration on his face as he ponders which necklace is right for his daughter. I see him giving it to my mother, the first of his children to go abroad, on a December evening here in Calcutta, the moon setting over the Hooghly River. On the desk in their room at the Great Eastern Hotel is a telegram from my mother's youngest brother that says, "Best of luck, safe journey." My mother's Samsonite suitcase lies open on the bed, packed with Darjeeling tea and Kata silk blessing scarves for her American sponsors. Winter was the pilgrimage season, and she was about to undertake a new journey that was also one of the oldest, the voyage made mythic by all who had set out from home in search of another life. In giving me her pendant, was my mother entrusting me with her story? She was the one who suggested I go to India after college. Maybe the pendant was a way of giving me a story she wanted told, but that she herself did not want to hold on to. Not only was she eager to leave behind the old-fashioned ideas about girls she'd grown up with, as a single working mother, she had neither time nor energy to look into the past. What might my life have been if I weren't the excavator and guardian of the family stories? What if I hadn't gone looking? It's been a push and pull, the desire to leave behind the struggles of growing up the daughter of an American psychiatrist and Tibetan mother in 1960s and 70s American suburbia, and at the same time, find my way to the source.
I wanted to start maybe by asking you a little bit about the journey with your mother, the sort of pilgrimage back to India that inspired the book. And I'm assuming that you kind of knew what you were up to when you went on that journey, that you knew that this was going to be a book. But I'm wondering kind of how the journey came about and how the project evolved from that journey.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I knew that it was going to be a book exactly. I knew that as writers, you know, we write like I was like, whatever I'm doing, I often just take notes on it. And I knew I wanted to take notes on this and maybe see that if this would be a book. But also, you know, my mother had been saying that she wanted to go to Dharamsala, which is, as I said, where the Dalai Lama lives in exile. And I didn't want to go, because we had a lot of kind of challenges and in our relationship. And as I say, for me, growing up Tibetan American, and I had a happy, peaceful and busy life in Tokyo and had young children. And I thought, you know, like some other time we'll do it. And then I was doing some research for a book I was working on, and I came across this quote from the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama said that we never know, we might die tonight, and that we don't want to have regrets. So of course, then I thought, this really hit me, because I thought, oh gosh, you know, my mother, you know, she's getting old, she's almost 80, maybe she wants to make a kind of pilgrimage back to where the seat of the Dalai Lama is, you know, of Tibet in exile, and that I would feel horrible if I hadn't helped her do that, right? And that, you know, it always seemed like she was going to live forever, but you know, now she was getting old. And the other thing is that my grandmother had died some years before, and in the Tibetan tradition, there are death horoscopes that are made. So in addition to birth horoscopes. And her death horoscope said that there were some things that were blocking her journey to the next life, right, in the Tibetan belief. And so, for example, her mind remained attached to certain things after she died. And one of the things that the horoscope said her mind remained attached to was an unresolved relationship with her daughters. And so this also really hit me because I thought I didn't want, again, of course, she's not going to live forever. And I didn't want things to be unresolved between us. And it's not like any big horrible thing happened, but there were just things, over the years. And I thought, I should take her, I should take her to Dharamsala. It was hard for her to do by herself. And also that I should think about, this would be a chance. This would be a chance. And it's always really easy. And this is what the Dalai Lama is saying, it's easy to think, I'll just do it later. It's always like later, I'll do it later, right? But that later may not come. And so that was a lot what motivated me to take that trip with her.
And then traveling between these 4 cities, you were taking notes and you thought, okay, this is something, I've stumbled upon something that I can work into.
And even then I wasn't sure it was something, because there's kind of I get very immersed in the experience of it. And so I wasn't at the same time thinking about, would it be a book or would it not be a book? And I was just sort of taking notes about the things that I felt and the things I noticed and the things I was, experiencing. And then I throw it all in there. And then when I get back to Tokyo, see
sort of sort through the different notes.
Right, right, exactly.
I wanted to ask you something about the excerpt that you just read, which I find incredibly beautiful and also unique in the way that you structure it. So we weave so easily, kind of so seamlessly between present day Calcutta, where you're traveling with your mother and we see her so vividly, under her red umbrella. And then kind of almost in the next sentence, we're plunged back into the past to 1951 when your mother's sort of looking into her suitcase. And so your present sensations on this trip are kind of cut with past memories that might have been your mother's or that might have been your grandfather's as he's looking in that old shop for the necklace that he's going to give her. And I guess I'm wondering how you came to this strategy or this technique of kind of weaving between the past and the present so fluidly.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting to me is how our minds work, and that we don't, we're often cycling in our minds between past and present, and then we speculate about the future. And that it's easy to think like the past is past. It's done, we're done with it, we've moved on, and this is the present. But I always, I often think of what Faulkner said, right, is that, the past is not dead, it's not even past, right? And that it's very much a part of our present lives and our present consciousness. And so one of the things that's very interesting to me is this like interweaving past and present in a way that mirrors or represents the way that actually our minds work. Or my mind anyway, I'm always like, like interweaving between, right, these things. And so in the way that the excerpt I just read, here we are, like I'm waving goodbye to a friend, and then here's my mother, and then I'm thinking about my grandmother, and then I'm speculating about, I don't actually know, what happened, and I obviously wasn't there in that hotel room in Calcutta in 1951, but that's the thing I often will think about in my imagination. What was it like? What might it have been like? And constructing a story around that. And I think that's very much the way our minds work too. And also that the past very much influences us in the present, whether we acknowledge that or not. It's always part of our either conscious or subconscious mental state. Yeah.
No, it's beautiful the way it comes up, because you get the sense of Calcutta as a place that's kind of haunted by your family history and by the things that the city and the place is bringing up for you.
Yeah, and it felt that way to me, and that's why I say it's like a ghost. It feels like there's kind of a ghost in the bedroom, and our family has a long history. Darjeeling is north of Calcutta, but very often we were in Calcutta, so we have a long history there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, you mentioned your grandmother's death horoscope and how there was this unresolved kind of mother-daughter tension, and you saw that your journey with your mother as an opportunity to sort of work through and perhaps resolve some of the tensions that you felt with your own mother. And I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe where the tension came from, and also what learning more about her upbringing and the history of your family, how that might have altered your perspective on the relationship with your mother, which is such a central part of this book.
Well, one of the things I realized, through this trip and through the research and times I've spent in India over the years is that there's very much this cultural divide that I was partly growing up in America, and partly growing up with an American psychiatrist father, right? So that was a certain orientation that he had and that we therefore had, that the children as well. And so, for example, on the American side, there's a whole emphasis on building self-esteem, right, of children, right? Build self-confidence, build self-esteem. And on, let's say my mother's side or Asian side, was humility, right? It wasn't about building, it wasn't about building up a child's self-esteem. It was about teaching a child humility, right? And another difference that I really noticed and that really impacted our relationship was in the American way, it's very good to express your feelings, right? So, let it out, talk it over, stuff, right? And in my mother's way, it's of course the opposite, which is keep your feelings in, and that this is actually a sign of character, right? It's a sign of character, it's a sign of self-discipline, it's a kind of decorum. Nobody wants to hear your feelings. You should
Keep those to yourself. Yeah.
Right, exactly. You can deal with them and then you can come back, right? And also this tendency, especially as I say, having my father as a psychiatrist, of an analysis, like analyzing everything, dissecting things. Why do you feel that way? What's going on here? Let's get into this and let's really talk about it. And on my mother's side, it would be more, it is what it is. There's no need for any kind of like deep mind analysis of things. We just kind of accept them and move on. And then another one that was really strong is that we were very much encouraged, I was very much encouraged by my father, and then of course by teachers and so on, to speak up, right? So speak up, question, right? Question your elders. And my father was always, he said, like, you're anybody's equal. And on my mother's side, it's like, actually, no, you're not. You're not anybody's equal. You're a child, and there's a hierarchy, and there's filial piety, right? And so forget that idea, right? And so there was, I think, at some point, she started to feel like I was too American, and I had been too much influenced by American ways of looking at things and by my father, and that her own mother, my grandmother, used to say that, even if your mother's 100, if your mother's 100 years old and you're 80, she has every right to tell you what to do, right? There's none of this like leaving the nest or, like autonomy and now I'm independent and I'm an individual. It's like, no matter what age we're at, right, that hierarchy stays in place, right? And so these were really some of the reasons. And the other thing I would mention here is that there were huge, from my grandmother who was born and raised in Darjeeling, and like rode her pony to Tibet in the 1920s and had a whole life there in Darjeeling, in India and Tibet. Between her and my mother, there's a huge change, right? Because my mother went to the States, as I said, at 19, and then she was living in California and like had a hot tub and, this whole other kind of life. And then between my mother and me, there's this huge change, because I'm American and she's not. And I was raised in, as I said, 60s and 70s California, which was very much like, and New Jersey, but especially California, very much this kind of free to be you and me kind of answer. So we really had these huge gaps, between generations. So that was another reason.
And maybe just clarifying, just to see the context of where some of her ideas are coming from, sort of helped you situate that.
Yeah, and to understand it better. And because when you're a child, you don't necessarily see those things and the structural pieces and this cultural gap and so on. It was just really, for me, I felt very often, very caught in between.
Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about about kind of growing up Tibetan American in the 60s and 70s in California, and what that was like for you in terms of race and ethnicity and so forth.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question as well. You know, I think that it's very different now in the States, right? But when I was growing up there, I can't think of any other Asians that I saw in school at all until I was in high school. You know, there just weren't any. And so I looked really different. You know, there weren't any Asian or part Asian kids. And so I felt very isolated, and often, you know, like people would tell me that I spoke good English, right? Or they would say, like, they say, oh, you know, your skin is kind of like swarthy, or your skin's kind of dark. And I remember I didn't, and people would say, they're like, actually say, not just other kids, but adults and so on, they'd be like, what are you? And, you know, I'd be like, well, you know, I'm American, right? And they're like, no, but really, what are you? Right. And actually, people still ask that question today. And I was born in Spain, actually, because my father was a flight surgeon stationed at a naval base there. And so I would say, oh, you know, I was born in Spain. And they'd be like, oh, you're Spanish. And I'd be like, yeah. That's Spanish, yeah. Because I really I didn't want to feel more different than I already felt. And I felt like if I said half Tibetan, that it would make things worse, because nobody had heard of Tibet. You know, the Dalai Lama only came out of Tibet in 1959. And so now everybody knows who the Dalai Lama is, but people didn't know in the 60s so much. And so it didn't really mean anything, and it just made me feel more foreign. And so when my Tibetan grandparents would come visit, and I loved them dearly, but my grandmother always wore, you know, she's like on her full Tibetan dress, you know, the full outfit. And so I was really worried that we were going to run into someone I knew, right? And my grandfather was very sociable and friendly. He's like, oh, he says, and, you know, introduce me to your friends. And I'm like, oh, they're really busy. They're really busy, you know, and I'll see, right? And so it was only when I started going to Darjeeling after college in my 20s that I started to feel connected in a more positive way to Tibetan heritage.
Yeah. I also kind of want to ask, thinking kind of forward about these mother-daughter relationships, I wanted to ask you about the third part of your memoir, which is kind of interspersed throughout the other parts and composed of letters to your daughter. How did your knowledge of your family history inform that relationship?
You know, I really, as I said when we started tonight, I really wanted to try to do things differently with my daughter. And my mother had, you know, certain struggles with her mother, and then we had, as I said, our challenges. And so, for example, especially with girls, like if you questioned, right, if you were asking why, often in the culture, the way my mother was raised, that was considered a sign of disrespect. Right. And so if somebody said something, or like your mother or your father, and you said, oh, why, it would mean that you were questioning them. You didn't believe them, or you were back talking, and so on. And that what I saw with my daughter, who had a very, very curious and determined nature, you know, as a young girl, is that she really just wanted to understand, you know, and she really just wanted to know. And so that I tried not to take it as a sign of disrespect, or, you know, that she would, and rather that to see it as a young person who wants to understand about the world. And that, or if she would get angry, for example, and that it wasn't cause for punishment, but, you know, often there was something going on. So for example, when our son was born, right, and she was very, very jealous, right, of him. And so there was a lot of acting out, which you say, oh, this is like a really badly behaved child. And instead, I tried to see it as, no, these are actually really normal emotions, right, that a young child is going to have in this kind of case. And I'm not going to like punish her or get angry at her or tell her to rein it in, and so on. So these were some things. And one of the things related to this is that there's an idea sometimes that we're fated in families to repeat patterns. So, you know, if you have bad relationships with certain people throughout the generations, that's going to carry to the next generation. And in the Tibetan belief, there's the idea of karma, and karma often people think means fate, but in the Tibetan belief, it actually means action, right? It's not that something is just set and there's nothing you can do about it. And so I remembered that. I tried to keep that in mind with my daughter, is that at any point, what direction our relationship was going to go on would depend on what I did today. What I did today, or what I did in the next, today will influence what comes tomorrow, and so on. And that I wasn't necessarily fated to have, have difficulties with her.
And it's also beautiful, given what we were talking about with the past and the present, how kind of sometimes the knowledge of the past is something that can inform your actions in the present and help shape, a future relationship.
Yeah. I think that's what I believe that.
Yeah. I'm curious about the title, Paradise Lands. How did you come to that title?
Paradise Lands, in the Tibetan Buddhist belief, there's something called Baal, and Baal, Beuyul, and Baal are paradise lands that are hidden, and they're only visible and they're only reachable if you have the right view, right, or the right perspective is the idea. And otherwise, it could be there and you just walk right by and you don't see it. And so the paths to paradise lands are very hard to walk, right? So, they're fraught with danger often. And so I actually wrote down something here. In the 1920s, there was an English botanist named Frank Kingdon Ward, and he was looking for this sacred waterfall in Tibet where this entrance might be to one of these paradise lands. And he failed, he couldn't find it. And he wrote of, quote, he said how awful the journey was. And he said there was perpetual rain, snakes and wild animals, giant stinging nettles, and myriads of biting and blood-sucking ticks, hornets, flies, and leeches. So it's like, it's a difficult journey. And many people looking for these paradise lands either give up, or they get lost, or they get killed. And so the journey has great danger, but also great possibility if you actually manage to get there. And so the metaphor, of course, is that this paradise, the ways of understanding my relationship, new ways of understanding my relationship with my mother, with my daughter, with my family history, with myself, are possible if I have the right perspective, right? And it doesn't mean, so in the ancient Tibetan scriptures, there's something very beautiful that said, which is that paradise is there if only we will see it. And so it's always there. And it doesn't mean that, for example, a perfect relationship is there, but it means that there's a way that we can come to peace with it, whatever that might look like. Right? And so that's where, so this idea of, kind of being on a pilgrimage with my mother through India, and looking as we're traveling, looking for new ways of seeing and new ways of being and new ways of relating and new ways of understanding, that would be the equivalent of these paradise lands. So that's where it comes from.
The idea of Baal or paradise lands, it reminds me of an essay of yours that I read that I warmly recommend to everyone in the audience, called Traveling in Bardo. It's an essay that really stuck with me because, and you use this concept of the Bardo kind of from Tibetan history and Tibetan kind of thinking. And I guess I wanted to ask you here, what, you use the concept of Bardo to talk about a very serious illness. And I wondered how that became the sort of structuring device or the driving force in your essay, how you came to that.
The essay is, so as Amanda said, called Traveling in Bardo, and it's on my website if anybody would like to read it. And basically, some years ago, I had a near fatal illness, and I was in the hospital for many weeks. And in the Tibetan belief, Bardo, right? Bardo is the period from death to rebirth. And there's like a Bardo journey or a Bardo passage. And it's also believed to be any time when your ordinary reality is suspended. So it could be, for example, when you're ill, right? And for me, that experience of being in the hospital for those weeks was very much like that. I really felt it in that way, and as a Bardo. And one of the big ideas related to the Tibetan Bardo is that when you are in it, that you should accept it, meaning you accept, okay, this bad thing has happened, this really bad thing has happened, but you should not give up hope. Right. And so, for example, if you go back to the idea of like the Bardo, the after death Bardo, obviously a really bad thing has happened if you've died, right? And so you've died, and a lot, and in the Tibetan kind of like, you know, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and so on, the idea is that the belief or the idea is that it takes people 4 days to accept that they're dead. And up to those before those 4 days, they're like, yo, I'm over here. Why are you guys crying? Everything's okay, right? And then at some point, the person realizes that actually they're dead and that they need to move on. And so in my case, it would have been not fighting against the reality of this really, really serious illness that I had and that I might not make it, but at the same time to accept that and not give up hope, right? And not just be like, well, there's nothing I can do. And just one of the things that really inspired me is my great-grandfather, who was a very devout Tibetan Buddhist. One day he was coming from Tibet to India by pony in the winter, and he got caught in an avalanche. And so he got buried, right? He was buried in this avalanche. And he prayed, he prayed to, and he took his prayer beads and he managed to stick his hand up above the snow, and the search party saw him, and then he was saved. And that came to me, when I was ill, because I thought it really, first of all, I kind of felt like almost like I was in the experience he was in, because everything was white in the hospital. I was in this white room with these white curtains, and there was like no color. There was no, it was like felt like I was buried, like he had been. And I thought, if he had not done that, right, if he had given up and not managed to stick his hand up so they could see him, he would have died. Right? And so that had a very profound impact on me when I realized it. And that's why I decided when I did not die, that I decided to write this essay, that I would use that as a way of talking about the experience and about my family history, and in interweaving all of that into this essay.
I'm going to ask one or two more questions, but I wanted to remind everyone, I'm seeing some questions come in through the chat, but I just wanted to remind everyone to sort of pose your questions to the chat, and we'll open it up in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
But Anne, you've written eloquently elsewhere, I think in some of your catapult columns, about traveling to India after you graduated from college to explore the Tibetan part of your identity, and getting to know Darjeeling and getting to know your grandmother. And I'm curious, I guess on maybe a more personal level, whether these explorations had anything to do with your eventual decision to settle in Tokyo, rather than moving back to the United States, for example. Do you see a connection there, or?
I think I do. It was funny because it was not a plan of mine. And at Princeton, actually, I majored in Comp Lit, in French and Latin American literature, and I'm a big Francophile. And so I actually came to Tokyo on my way to Paris, and 30 years ago, right? And I liked it so much here that I stayed. And I think what it is that when I came to Japan, there's a lot of, I had, as I said, this kind of emotionally chaotic childhood and young adulthood, and that there's a real value placed on order here, and not just order for the sake of order, but order that enables a very harmonious and peaceful existence. And that was really important to me. And aesthetically, it's so beautiful here. And so it was this beautiful environment and this beautiful sort of very peaceful. And I ended up through various kind of fluky circumstances living in a tea house that this family had built for the grandmother, and she had died, and then they rented it out. And so I found myself, like in this kind of Zen, like little tea house with this little garden in an old neighborhood with temples and graveyards and so on around. So it was very, 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 you know, is very kind of supportive, rejuvenating sort of environment for me. And the other thing that really completely blew me away about Japan was that it was safe. Meaning, like, you know, you could, as a woman, as a young woman, you know, I could walk anywhere at any time and nobody ever bothered me, right? So I could, at 4 o'clock in the morning, if I wanted to go for a walk, I did. You just like walk through the streets. And so I really felt, for the first time, I felt very at home in the world, you know, because I had space, I had time, I had peace, and I had this safety, right? And so I felt like I could really think and start doing a lot of creative work, right? And so Flaubert, you know, Flaubert didn't like France very much, and he loved Egypt. And he said that it was a country that made him dream and where he felt well. And I always think of that, you know, for me with Japan, because I've always felt that way. It's kind of, it's, for me, it's between East and West. Like India would be too close that way, and California would be too close that way. And so it's this kind of island in a perfectly situated way for me.
Right. Sort of in between space.
Right, exactly, exactly.
I want to close with just a question that's sort of close to my heart. I'm also really interested in writing about place and in particular strategies that we develop as writers for kind of helping the reader experience place. And I know that your memoir moves from Delhi to Dharamshala to Calcutta to Darjeeling. Do you have kind of techniques or things that you found that work well for you for kind of opening up a sense of place in your writing?
There's the old, you know, I mean, the really basic thing of details, right? So details and the details that you can capture about a place, you know, I think can really open it up. And it could be, you know, like 5 senses, right? What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? So on. And of course, one can go too far in that direction. Sometimes you see that, you know, where there are too many details. And so it's really, you know, you hear this thing about, oh, the telling detail, you know, which is true, but it's also, it's what details resonate for me.
Mm.
And so, and that's what I think is really interesting. And that's why sometimes I think when people say, oh, I don't know how to write about my family, or I don't know how to write about my past or whatever, like there's this way, but there isn't a way. It's just what stands out for you and what resonates for you and what your obsessions are. Right.
Yeah.
So it makes me laugh because of course the things I notice are always in line with my obsessions. Right. I think that's true for everyone. Yeah.
So you're really kind of anchoring it in your point of view and making sure that, you know, the things that are sort of most salient for you come onto the page to kind of keep it unified and not to have just too many details.
Yeah. So it's an exercise in point of view, right? Because I noticed that, you know how like you can have 2 people looking at a landscape, and somebody who really loves computers will be like, oh, you know, like they'll notice like the more kind of technological or technical aspects, and then somebody who's obsessed with, you know, architecture is going to be like, oh, look at that, you know. And so everyone's got their like different, you know, frames that they put on it.
Yeah. So this seems to me like a good time to sort of open things up to open the discussion to questions. So
Yeah, I'm happy to take it on from here, Amanda. So we've got a couple of questions and that are quite related. They have to do with each generation. So we have questions about Tibetan heritage, and I'll give you the specific questions, but the questions are on the Tibetan heritage and perceptions of it from your mother's perspective, from yours, and from your daughters. So we have all 3 generations covered in these questions. So the first one from Oye was asking, growing up in India, did your mother feel very immersed in her Tibetan heritage, or did she feel there was an element of it lost even before she left for California and lived in a Western lifestyle? The next question from Peter Lee, how has living in Japan affected your sense of being Tibetan American? And then another one from Oye, just because they're all tied together, and how is that Tibetan heritage passed on to your daughter, or not so much?
Okay, yeah, thank you for those questions. I would say, you know, the Tibetan heritage for my mother, she, I mean, she was like of course, immersed in it because she was growing up with it, and you know, I didn't have a choice in that sense, right? And she personally was very happy to leave. She's, as I said, a doctor, and she really was happy to leave the kind of the old world for the new, right? And this kind of like the brightly lit kind of scientific world of, you know, Western medicine. And she also did not make any effort to raise us with Tibetan Buddhism or knowledge about, you know, her upbringing and so on, because I think a lot of it is because she wanted us to feel that we fit in. And so she didn't want us to feel different. And so instead of, like, we didn't celebrate Tibetan New Year, we celebrated Christmas, we celebrated Easter, we did trick-or-treating, you know, we did all the American things, right? And so she really wanted us to feel that. And my children, as far as my children, my daughter, I have really made an effort, you know, like from when she was very small, I think from when she was about 1, and we started going to India and going to Darjeeling and taking her there, and so she knew my grandmother very well, and was very familiar with that whole environment. And then she actually decided when she was in high school to work for 2 summers in Dharamsala with Tibetan refugees. And so she definitely feels some sort of, you know, connection there that from her growing up in that way. Also possibly from, she was born and raised in Tokyo. And so also possibly from having been growing up in Asia rather than growing up in the States. The question of how living in Japan has affected my sense of being Tibetan American, that's also a really interesting question. I would say that there's something, this is another reason that I think I felt very comfortable in Japan. When I got here, I was like, oh, everyone's Asian. I was like, you know, this is amazing. Wow. You know, it's like, I was like surrounded by, like, you know, and it was so remarkable to be in this environment where the dominant, you know, the dominant people were Asian. And so that was another reason I felt very comfortable. And I think another reason that it gave me a feeling of more creative space to explore that than perhaps I had felt in the States.
Thank you, Anne. Lisa Garnick, class of 77, asked the question, can you talk about your feelings, especially given the Tibetan norms about subjectivity and family as a unit that is of greater importance than the individual, about writing about your family? Were there limits on what stories you felt that you could tell?
There are always limits. I think, you know, yes, yeah, there are. And I think, you know, I've thought a lot about it, and one needs to when writing memoir. And what it comes down to a lot is what stories do you feel are yours to tell? Right? And so I mean, a more extreme example would be like if I took my friend's story about something terrible that happened to her and told it, that's not really my story to tell, right? And so the question is, and it's tricky, you know, because there's a gray area, like if it's something between you and somebody in your family, you know, how much of that is yours to tell, and, you know, how much is it infringing, and it also really depends on your family, you know. So I have a friend who wrote a memoir, and she was really worried that her mother in particular was going to be upset, and her mother's like, I don't care. She goes, it's like, you know, she goes, write what you like. It's that's your, you know, that was your experience, you know, I love you, you know, go do what you want to do, right? But other people are like not at all like that, and so that it also really depends on that. And so it's a very I would say case by case kind of call.
And I would assume it's also a function of the light in which the other person is portrayed, right? Even if it's a fairly private story, but it portrays them in a very positive, you know, learning kind of an experience, then you feel better about sharing it than it's one where it's really a subject of negative feelings from all people around, even to this day, kind of a situation.
Right. You know, and again, there's a balance, because often people, and you know, you maybe you pull your punches as a child, right? Because you learn that you shouldn't talk about certain things, or you shouldn't do. And so where is the line between where you are self-censoring where you're censoring yourself in order to maybe you think spare other people's feelings, but maybe they don't spare yours, right? And they don't they don't censor themselves in relation to you. So where does there's a lot of thought that goes into that. I think of where where that line really is, and where are you kind of expressing the things that you need to express, or where would you be infringing on somebody else?
For me, writing sort of stories of my mother, I've tried to take the approach of just putting it all down, and then later on I'll figure out what gets taken out. But when the creative juices are going, it seems better to just harvest them and just keep brainstorming on it, and then move on from there. Anyway, so another question from Arthur Yee. How would the Anne of 1984 respond to the current Anne's insights?
She probably would feel that this was quite public, because I was very, very private person, and in that sense, I really took to heart, what I kind of had been told, or how I'd been brought up, is that there, you needed to kind of toe the line and not talk about things that you shouldn't talk about, and so on. And not like there's anything so incendiary, but but it's interesting how often things that people think that they can't write about, and then they write about it, and it doesn't like blow the world up, and it doesn't like it's actually like a really good thing said. So it's more just, there are things that I would have felt that I couldn't say, that were good for me to say, that were good for me to express, like some of the things that I've talked about tonight, that back 30 years ago I would have felt was difficult, right? It was too much for me to do.
And from Uchi Han, do you think Japan is more amazing as a country for a foreigner rather than a native who would be more expected to conform to the order of the society? And I also had a related question to that, because you're saying that coming into Japan, you were surrounded by Asians and you felt connected, like you belonged. Whereas the experience of many Chinese Americans going to China is a sense of, oh, you really don't belong. You may look the same, but you're really not.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, perhaps one difference too is that I don't look the same here. I don't look Japanese, and Japanese people generally don't think I'm Japanese, or or part Japanese, or there's like some kind of Asian, but so in answer to that question, of course, if I were here as a Japanese young woman, or I'd come as a Japanese young woman, it's very different. And I teach at a Japanese women's university, and it's a very different situation for them. And so, yeah, coming, and it probably was the same for my mother, when she went to New York in the 1950s, it was like she was set free, it was like, she'd broken out into freedom, and probably if you were coming from New York and you had your family there and all, you might not have felt that way. But for her, America really was the land of the free. And so it really does depend, on where you're coming from.
Gordon Kingsley asked the question, and I'm struck by how many long distance journeys your tale involves. The enormous trip of your mothers from northern India to America, the family trips to India, your own travels to Asia and Europe, and regular visits from Japan to the US. In this lockdown COVID world, it is hard to picture this much global interconnectedness. How do you imagine your family story playing out in a world where we cannot take travel for granted?
Well, in other ways, like this, like what we're doing tonight. And interestingly, I talk a lot with my mother by FaceTime, like now, because we can't see each other, and so we talk on FaceTime, and the same thing with my daughter, who's in the States. And I see it as metaphorical traveling. So yeah, we can't get on a plane. We can't get on a plane and go to such and such place right now, and certainly not to India is difficult right now. But we are journeys together in our relationship is continuing in an interesting way, you know. And so it's we're communicating in different ways because of COVID and because of the ways that we, you know, because we can't see each other in person. And it's a continuation in that way.
I have a couple of general questions in terms of the writing process. And how do you manage it when you have a mind block? And how do you find the discipline to keep working with all the distractions given all the other aspects of your life that you have?
That's a great question. I'd love to hear from Amanda too about that, as you as a writer, how you manage that.
Yes,
I think
that question should be for both of you. So yes, sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, Amanda, what do you do? Like, do you find that what do you do if you feel blocked, or do you ever feel blocked?
I do feel blocked sometimes. I find that I think part of it is just kind of learning your own rhythms. And I found that for a while, the time of day matters to me. So I'm a morning writer, and I think just having that sense of routine is important to me, and also kind of giving myself the space to mess up on one day. You know, I get frustrated, and sometimes it doesn't come. But
Yeah.
I'm the sort of writer where I don't set myself a word limit. I just say I'm gonna be here for 2 hours, or I'm gonna be here for 4 hours, and I'm gonna show up, and maybe some other characters will show up, maybe something will start to happen. And if it doesn't, I know that sometimes that blockage is part of the process. In the moment when it's happening, it's terrible. It's not comfortable.
Right.
But I do notice a pattern. It's not perfect, but sometimes after those days of really kind of just sort of slogging through and not feeling like anything is really lighting up, sometimes the next day it comes rather effortlessly. It tends to come for me in little spurts. So I think the biggest challenge for me is trusting the process and showing up every day, even though some days it really feels like I'm just sort of staring into the nothing. So just kind of,
Yeah. And I also write by time, not by word count. And so at whatever time I have on a given day, I'll be like, oh, okay, you know, I'm going to write for 2 hours. And I find if I have a word count that it puts pressure on me in a bad way, because I don't want to just write words, right? And so, but the time thing is, and I'm very strict. Like if I'm like, okay, is 2 hours, like I'm not going to do like 1 minute less or whatever. I actually wait till it's exactly that, because you don't know, like, I think there really is something about showing up. You show up at your desk, you show up at your computer, and you're creating this space, this creative space to engage with whatever's going to come up for you that day. And if I write one line or I write one paragraph and then I delete it, I'm okay with that. Okay, I don't feel like I have to come away from the desk with 5 pages. And I often tell my students this, because they're like, oh, you know, I really want to write and I can't write and it's not coming. But if you show up, like if I show up at the desk every day, or, you know, maybe it's not every day for you, every other day, whatever, it will come. It will come, but it won't. I find if I'm like running around doing other stuff and I don't actually sit down and just make that time and space for it. And even, you know, there's a Japanese writer named Banana Yoshimoto who wrote a really popular book called Kitchen. And she, that was a huge bestseller here and abroad. And she said that sometimes she only gets half an hour at the keyboard because she's busy, but even that she'll do. And I always remembered that. So even if I only have half an hour, I just sit down, I'm like, you know, and it's very interesting because sometimes you'll get your best ideas that way. Like I actually wrote a lot more after I had kids than before I did. So, and I had like, you know, like no time as you know, everyone knows, like once you have kids, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to be able to write. But because I had that limit and I had to do it, I'm like, okay, they're napping, you know, I like run and I read and I knew that I just had like a, you know, a X amount of time till I heard them get up. So that process works really well. I think just showing up at the desk. And so I don't feel blocked. It's difficult sometimes when it's slow, or you write something and you're like, oh, this is not good, you know, or it's not working. But what's really interesting is often the next paragraph you write will be really working. And so I
Nancy,
sometimes think you needed to write that bad one,
right.
right? To get
Open the
the
tap,
good
let
one,
all the rusty water come out, and then something
right?
clear emerges. I wanted to add something that I read a couple days ago that really sort of captured this process for me. It was an interview with the poet Robert Haas, and he said, "Will and discipline do not write poems, but will and discipline create the space into which a poem might come." And I think I feel that that's how my relationship with will and discipline work, especially when I'm engaged in a longer project like a novel, just kind of creating that space into which something might come and being receptive when it does.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And there's not, often people, there's a really romantic vision of like you sit down and you have your coffee and you're like, oh, I'm a writer, I'm going to write now. And it's actually like really hard. There's a lot of like really, it's not like this, like, sitting down like Marguerite Duras and like having this romantic interlude, and sometimes that happens, but often it's just really, really hard going. But in a way that I would imagine is true with any kind of art, like whether you're a sculptor or a musician or whatever it might be, that you have to like really, there's a lot of real, and writing has a lot of craft, there's a lot of craft, and so again, there's often an idea that, you just write, right? But there are a lot of things that you need to like, I think that like scales on the piano, or I'm not a pianist, but like there are things you need to know how to do, right, in order sometimes to get to where you want to be.
And Hidekazu asked, and it seems you've done a lot of work looking into the past to connect to the present. Have you thought about the more speculative but equally fascinating world of writing about the future?
In a way I have, because I think that when you're writing, whatever you're writing is about the future in a way, right? So, not like in a speculative way of like what may happen in the future, but in the sense that whatever is going on now is what we were talking about earlier this evening about past, present, existing in a sense all in the present, in our minds and in our hearts, and that those are like that's part of the future as well. Like how is what's happening now leading to what's happening next, or what's going to happen a day from now or a week from now, whatever. So in that sense, I always have it in mind. And actually in the Tibetan belief, past, present, and future are all coexistent. There's not this, we think of it as a linear progression, but in the Tibetan belief, it's not. They're all like here together.
A somewhat more prosaic question.
Uh-huh.
How did you and Amanda meet? How did the idea of this talk come together? Because you're wonderful discussants together.
Yeah, we've had a bit of practice. The answer is Anne came and talked to my class, and actually it's interesting because we met at a cafe by the university where I teach on, I think it was like March 12th. It was maybe the day before France declared that universities would be online, and then we went into full confinement and lockdown 3 days later. So my glass of wine with Anne was maybe the last time that I was sort of out in the world. And so we did a Zoom conversation with my creative writing students, and they'd read her essay, Traveling in Bardo, and perhaps a few other pieces as well. And so we talked about the craft of nonfiction, and yeah, it was a really nice discussion. So I'm really to be asked to repeat it again here, or not to repeat it, but to do a variation.
Yeah. And so it was a memoir writing workshop for Amanda students, and it was really the great students. So yeah, that's how we met, and this is continuing the conversation.
Excellent. So we have a few more minutes if someone wants to quickly shoot in a question, but otherwise I'm going to ask Anne and Amanda if they'd like to give us some key messages, closing remarks for us to take away on the rest of our day or evening.
Well, I would say that, first of all, thank you so much to everybody for making time to join this conversation, and I hope that in various ways we can continue it, and that whether you're a writer or you're thinking about writing, or you you know are reading memoirs or books about family history, I think that it's identity is not just a thing about if you're Asian American or you're or if you had difficulties with it necessarily, but just that it's a deepening of understanding who we are and who we are in the world. And I think especially now people are thinking about it, because of COVID and the challenges we have of seeing the people we care about, and we're concerned maybe about losing them. And one thing I would really encourage everyone to do, if you have interest in it, is my father passed away 8 years ago. And before he did, maybe a few years before, I actually found somebody to interview him about his life, and to write a kind of, to put it all together into this informal sort of book. And I'm so grateful that I did that, because he would have died with all of that unsaid, and things that we wouldn't have known. And so I would really encourage, in whether to talk to the people who you care about and who aren't going to be around forever, and find out their stories, and just communicate in that way with them.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I don't have anything else to add. I think that was beautifully said.
Okay, well, thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Anne and Amanda. I speak on behalf of all the people who are on. This was a wonderful session. I found it very instructive and just interesting stories, and it's going to get a lot of my creative juices and thought juices going for our own stories. So thank you everyone for joining this session, and this was really a delight.
It really was. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.